Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm very appreciative of this wonderful award. And let's just jump right into it. I want to begin by clearing up some possible misunderstanding about the title of my talk, Strangers to Ourselves. Those of you who are independent music fans may know that the group Modest Mouse issued an album with that same name just a few weeks ago after an 8-year hiatus. And you may think that I stole my title from them, but that was also the title of my book from a number of years ago, and I have it on good authority that they actually named their album after my book. So just to clear that up. Self-knowledge is obviously an important topic in literature, personally, philosophy, everyday life. The oracle in Delphi famously is inscribed with "Know thyself." Many of great literature, including Shakespeare's tragedies, have as its theme self-knowledge. This is a scene from King Lear at the end of the play where he's holding his daughter Cordelia after her death, realizing that what he really thought was important to him in life was far from it. It is the object of, or the point of insight psychotherapies. And some forms of meditation have as their goal a better access to our internal states. But oddly, it has not been a central topic in psychology, at least not until recently. There are no journals of self-knowledge, no professional societies with that topic. Very few college courses, as far as I know, on that topic. Exceptions are one that I teach and one that Samin teaches at her university. And the question is why? And I just want to spend a couple of seconds delving back to the history of psychology and talk about this fork in the road from the 1940s and 1950s, where the topic of self-knowledge was most closely associated with Freud and psychoanalysis. Freud, however, eschewed the empirical method. He thought that it wasn't really appropriate to study the mind through the scientific method. The case method was what he preferred. And in the 1950s, Kurt Lewin, who you see on the right of your screen, took a different fork and argued that we could study the mind and the social situation empirically, as with great experimental techniques. Even so, I think for the next few decades, people were shy about studying such topics as self-knowledge and consciousness, partly out of fear that we'd be misidentified with that other fork and we'd be Freudians and unscientific. And so it's not a topic that was addressed much at all. And there are also, I think, some important methodological reasons for that I will touch on. Times are changing, and that's a book that Samin and I edited a few years ago that has many excellent chapters on self-knowledge. So what I want to do today is to give you a broad overview of this topic and what kind of research has addressed it, what the major questions are. In terms of an outline, there are 3 kinds of self-knowledge that I'll talk about. I really want to consider this more broadly than it perhaps has in past treatments. So when we think about self-knowledge, usually we think of how aware we are of our current states and emotions and traits, and that is indeed something I'll touch on. But I want to begin by talking about how well we know our past selves, which I think is an important form of self-knowledge. Do I know who I was in the past in terms of what my attitudes and feelings were? And also, how well I know my future self. Am I accurate at predicting how I'll feel in the future, who I will be in the future? These are all important forms of self-knowledge. I will close with a step back in talking about some bigger picture issues. How can we achieve self-knowledge? What does that mean? Is it a good thing to aspire to? And there are 3 themes that I'm going to weave in on all these topics. The first is what I call the direct access fallacy, the idea that the most important route to self-knowledge is navel-gazing, introspection. And although I think it's an important source of information, it is not something which perhaps is the best path to self-knowledge because of the limits of introspection. Because of that, the second theme is that self-knowledge, much like our knowledge of the external world, is a theory-driven construction. We have some information, we have to put it together in some kind of coherent way using our theories as to who we are. And the third theme is about accuracy, a hotly debated question as to whether it's good or bad to have accurate self-knowledge, and that's something I'll return to towards the end of the talk. So let's begin with knowledge of our past self. As we look back on who we were, how we felt, what kind of personality traits we had, is this something that we're accurate at? And in terms of the criterion, just a quick methodological aside, I think this one is pretty straightforward, that a typical study measures people's attitudes or beliefs or behaviors at time one, lets some time pass, and then asks the person to recall what those attitudes or behaviors were. So we have a pretty easy way of assessing self-knowledge here. How accurately can I recall who I was in the past, which the researcher has measured. So the first theme, the direct access fallacy, I think applies here, that most of our memory is constructive, particularly long-term memory. It's not like all my attitudes and beliefs and traits are somehow a part of my brain where those are directly stored. Instead, it's a constructive process where I try to remember who I was and how I felt, and I'm very much inferring more than directly recalling. Much of what I'll have to say here was said many years ago by Michael Ross in a really great 1989 Psych Review paper in which he talked about how memory for our past selves work. And he basically made 2 points, that we view the past through the lens of the present. So we first check how we feel now, and then try to guess how we felt in the past. And we apply theories as to whether it's reasonable to think that we have changed or not. What are these theories? Well, as Tony Greenwald said a number of years ago, one is that we're really good people, that we're motivated historians. We tend to reconstruct our past in ways that make us look good and favorable. We're more apt to remember our successes than our failures, for example. And another theory is that we're pretty stable. Most of us have a sense that we don't change particularly much, that it's not like 10 years ago, I was on one end of the political spectrum, and now I'm on the opposite, that regardless of how I really felt, we tend to think, no, that people are stable. And this applies to behavior, and it leads to some interesting errors. So there's a well-established finding in the political science literature that if you ask people who they voted for in previous elections, say presidential elections, many more people say they voted for the president than actually did. And it appears that people, particularly if they support the candidate now, they say, surely I must have voted for that person. So even something as discrete, or you would think easy to remember, as which lever I pressed in the voting booth, people sometimes are inaccurate at recalling. Michael Ross and the students had a nice demonstration of this in the laboratory, where they gave people persuasive communications arguing that it's really good to brush your teeth a lot, or actually it hurts the enamel, you shouldn't brush your teeth that often. And they were successful. People changed their minds in one direction or the other. And then they asked them, well, by the way, how often have you brushed your teeth in the past few weeks? And people's recall was influenced by this attitude change. So if they now thought it was really good to brush your teeth, they said, yeah, I've brushed my teeth a lot. And if not, well, not so much. And I think in these studies, people are honestly trying to come up with the right answer. It's just memory is a constructive process. The same is true of attitudes. There's some well-known studies showing that you can change people's attitudes and they don't realize they've changed. I'll tell you briefly about an old study of ours that showed this with a couple of wrinkles. So in this study, we were interested partly in what people's theories were about how their attitudes change. And so we first wanted to change their minds with one of 2 techniques. Our participants were a group of college students who were all very opposed to the legalization of marijuana. And then we tried to change that attitude in one of 2 ways. We either gave them a well-crafted speech, a persuasive communication, or we had them listen to an audio tape with subliminal messages embedded in it. And so we had their attitudes measured at time 1. They're really against marijuana legalization. Time 2, a couple weeks later, we give them one of these attitude change techniques, and then we see if we were successful. But relevant to this point I want to make now, we also then ask them to recall how they had felt at time 1. And this is what we found on a 9-point scale that goes from disagree strongly to agree strongly that marijuana should be legalized. You can see these bars are very low because we selected people who we knew were very opposed to the legalization of marijuana. This is how they felt at time one. A couple of weeks go by, we give them either our speech or our subliminal message, and as we expected, the speech was actually much more successful at changing attitudes than the subliminal message. So for these kinds of studies, that's big change. You know, they didn't go above the midpoint, but they now are 2 or 3 points more favorable towards the legalization of marijuana if they got our speech. That difference in the subliminal condition was not significant. But again, relevant to the point here, we then asked them, okay, how did you feel at time one? Remember, you came in, you answered our attitude questionnaire, and people pretty much how they felt now is how they think they felt 3 weeks ago. So that yellow bar is actually not significantly different from the orange one. And again, with the subliminal speech, not much change in either direction. So even though we brought about pretty substantial change, people didn't know that they had changed. Okay, what about this third theme, whether self-knowledge of our past is good or bad? I think there probably are some positive consequences of inaccuracy if it produces a sense of stability. That's probably a good thing, one might argue. Dan Gilbert and Jordi Quadback and I published a paper about the end of history illusion, that where we are now, we tend to think we've changed as much as we're ever going to change. Maybe we recognize we changed a little in the past, but we tend to think of ourselves as stable beings, and that probably is reassuring in many ways. But there may be some negative consequences, and in fact, that study with the marijuana attitudes, one purpose of it was to see if people knew which of those two approaches would change their attitudes the most. So we had another group of participants who were also opposed to the legalization of marijuana. And we said, okay, we're going to try to change your mind, and which one would you rather get, the persuasive communication or the subliminal messages? People's theory was that subliminal messages are much more powerful. So indeed, 71% preferred to see the speech, the very thing that was really successful at changing their attitudes. So not knowing how all this works, one might argue, is not such a good thing. We can put ourselves in situations that lead to unwanted change. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have to say about knowledge of our past. Memory is reconstructive, and accuracy probably a two-edged sword. What about knowledge of our current self? Again, I think this is what we usually mean by self-knowledge. How well do I know what my own attitudes and beliefs are? So that's where we are in the talk. Now, this is a little more of a complicated question for a couple of reasons. One is it's more difficult methodologically. So if I tell you that I think I'm mildly introverted, on what basis could you challenge that? How could you say I'm wrong? Or if I tell you that I think I'm in favor of this particular political candidate, how could you possibly show I'm wrong? Well, that's a philosophical question that's been debated. In psychology, it's been addressed basically by coming up with some other criterion of how I feel that maybe you can challenge my statement. So those criteria have been implicit measures that might give a different answer than my verbal report. Peer reports, how my friends think I feel. How does that compare to what I say? And also how well my reports predicts my behavior as another indication of accuracy. The answer also depends on what kind of current state we're talking about. So that's why this is a little more complicated, that I think there's no blanket answer we can give about self-knowledge of our present selves. We have to break this down a little further and talk about, well, what kind of state are we talking about? So let's go through some of them. And one that I think perhaps there's some of the clearest evidence is knowing why we've done something or feel the way we do. These are reports that we know from other literatures are some clear cases of people giving wrong answers. One, if any of you were at Mike Zanaga's talk yesterday, Most of you probably know of his research with split brain patients where there are clear cases of confabulation. We know that they reached for an object with their left hand because of something that was flashed to their right hemisphere, and yet they give a confabulated response with their left brain interpreter. Also true of some brain damage. The article that Dick Nisbett and I published in 1977, one way of summarizing that is to simply say it extends that to you and I who have a corpus callosum, that we too are confabulators, at least to a big degree. We use our theories about why we've done what we've done. And one source of evidence for this is that often strangers can give answers, explanations of our behavior that are as accurate as our own. So let me go through one old study to make this point and then summarize this literature. So this is a study we did many years ago in which we had college students for 5 weeks rate their mood every day, and also several things that might predict their mood. So they rated the weather, how their work was going, their relationships, what else, what day of the week it was, a bunch of things that might or might not predict their mood. After the 5 weeks, they then told us what they thought these relationships were. So we said, how much did your sleep predict your mood over the course of these 5 weeks, the day of the week, your relationships, and so on. And this allowed us to compute an accuracy correlation for each participant. So if I were in the study, how accurate was my report about the predictability of sleep with how much sleep really predicted my mood during this 5-week period. And averaging across participants, we found that there's accuracy correlation was 0.4, highly significant. Not terrible. It's not a huge proportion of the variance, but it shows that people aren't completely wrong at knowing what predicts their mood. But then we asked a group of strangers, also college students, to guess what they thought the average relationships were between sleep and mood, day of the week, and so on, to compare whether a complete stranger, how did their accuracy compare to the actual participants. And it was 0.45, pretty much the same. Now, it's a little more nuanced than that, and I want to illustrate this to you with a Venn diagram. So what we see here, let me see if my little pointer will work, yeah. So this represents the actual causes of our behavior, what, say, is really causing our mood. This circle here represents the actor's, his or her own causal report, and this circle is the stranger's. And this correlation I just told you of the actor's accuracy is the intersection of these two circles. That's the actors are accurate at estimating what the actual causes are. These two, this area here is the stranger's accuracy, and you can see it's about the same. But you'll also notice that there's not a complete overlap between the two. So what we see here, this is actually a partial correlation from the study I just told you about of the actors' reports partialing out the strangers' reports, showing that, and it's highly significant, showing that actors do have some unique insight as to what predicts their mood that is not captured by causal theories that strangers use. So this shows, and it actually initially seemed, wow, this is inconsistent with the Nisbett and Wilson point, that there is some unique insight here. But if you compute this partial correlation, we also find that strangers are getting a piece of the accuracy that actors are not. The causal theories, that actors avoid causal theories at their risk, and it actually leads to missing some things that are predicting their behavior. So just to summarize that point, we can bring privileged information to bear that helps us understand why we do what we do. But on balance, it doesn't seem to give us much advantage over strangers. Okay. What about knowing our personalities? I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly and actually rely on some of Samin's work in this area. Do we know our own personality traits? Well, again, what's the criterion? Pretty much the same ones have been used, I mentioned before. Implicit measures like the IAT, how peers think what our personality traits are, and how well our reports predict our behavior. And summarizing from an article by Samin, we see that these are the correlations between implicit measures and self-reports of personality traits. Not particularly impressive. Again, there's some ambiguity here. Does that mean people are wrong, or maybe the implicit measures are not particularly valid? That's a very hard question to answer, but let's kind of look at the big picture. Let's compare to our own reports to how our friends think we feel, our peer reports. And here, a little higher for the big 5 personality traits. There is some overlap. If I think I'm a little introverted, then my friends would kind of agree with that, but not entirely. Those correlations aren't all that high. And as I said, this does raise the question of, okay, if my friends and I disagree as to my personality, who's right? And one way of answering that question is to see, well, how well do these reports predict my behavior? Are my friends better at it than I, or am I better than they are? And basically, it's a wash. Some other work of Samin's showing that friends' reports and peer reports predict a person's behavior to about the same degree, but not always the same variance. Again, it's kind of like the Nisbet and Wilson point, that maybe on balance they're about the same, but I think each is getting a unique portion of the variance. And this was made beautifully in a very recent paper that came out in Psych Science with an interesting data set. These researchers had personality reports from some adults who were in their 20s in the 1930s. So they had rated their own personality on dimensions that were roughly equivalent to the big 5. They also had 5 friends rate their personality. And given the time this was done, this study could use what we might think of as the ultimate dependent measure, mortality, which reports predicted how long these people lived, because they're actually all deceased now. And one might think, well, surely my knowledge of my own personality would predict this better, but in fact, the friends ratings predicted better how long people would live than the self ratings. So the moral here is, if you want to estimate how long you're going to live, ask your friends to estimate your personality. I'll skip through this one pretty quickly. Again, to be honest, I think this area is a little bit of a morass. How well do we know or know attitudes? There's no doubt that our attitudes are sometimes constructed. There's no doubt that correlations between implicit and explicit measures are often low. I think sometimes people have exaggerated how to interpret that to say that our attitudes are unconscious. Nonetheless, we published an article in Psych Review a number of years ago that at least allows for that possibility, that under some circumstances, I do think it's possible to have an attitude of which we're unaware. What about our current emotions? If we know anything, one would think it's our emotional state, how angry, how sad, how euphoric we're feeling. And yet, it's well known that even emotions can be constructed, at least to some extent. We're inferring how we feel in part from the situation we are in. And it's possible these constructions are wrong. Again, I think this is probably the exception to the rule. I do think emotions are something we're mostly aware of. But one can point to times, at least, such as repression, which brings back Freud into the picture, that sometimes we may not want to know how we feel, or other times when there's a strong feeling rule that is contrary to our feelings. I think that can make it hard to know how we actually feel about something. So there are various feeling rules, such as our wedding day will be the happiest day of our life. And that makes it hard to recognize that, we're kind of pissed off at Uncle Harry who's getting drunk and hitting on the bridesmaids. Same thing about funerals or jealousy. We have strong theories as how we ought to feel in these situations, which I think can make it harder to detect how we really feel. So to summarize, knowledge of our current self, limited direct access, often constructions, and accuracy. I want to come back to this question. Again, there's a lot of debate as to whether it's good or bad to be accurate, so we will return to that one. But in the meantime, let's move on to our knowledge of our future selves. This is work that I've done largely with Dan Gilbert on affective forecasting that looks at how we know how we'll feel in the future. I think these same themes apply here. So by definition, we don't have direct access to the future unless we believe in clairvoyance. So it has to be a construction. How will I feel if a certain event occurs in next week or in 6 months? I have to infer that. And accuracy here may be a two-edged sword as well. So affective forecasting, again, it's very hard to summarize a couple of decades of work in a couple of minutes, but I will try. How will I feel if X occurs? There are systematic errors. The most common one is the impact bias, where people overestimate the intensity and duration of their feelings. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. The most common reasons are focalism, which is that we focus on this one event we're thinking about and neglect to realize there'll be other things in our life impacting our emotions. And immune neglect, which is the idea that we don't take into account basically how resilient we'll be and adapt to particularly negative events. But let me give you a concrete example. Let's say this woman is trying to imagine how she will feel if her candidate is elected president in the 2016 presidential election. And what might make her predictions accurate or inaccurate? Well, to illustrate that, let me first show you how she's going to feel when the event really happens. So time 2 is the election has happened, her candidate has been elected. If she's a Democrat, let's say it's Hillary Clinton, she's thrilled that Hillary was elected. If she's a Republican, well, it would take me the rest of the talk to list all the Republican candidates it could be, so I won't. But whatever, she's happy, because her let's say that it was kind of a close election, and so her initial reaction here is that she's happy. But that's going to be influenced by other things happening in her life at that time. So let's say she's having a tough week at work. Maybe she has a cold. There's going to be other things that temper that. Now, if we're going to look at how that reaction lasts over time, we also have to take into account that that's going to fade. And the more she makes sense of this event, adapts to it, the reaction will fade. So she has to take that into account when making the forecasts. So now let's look at the time 1, when she's making the prediction, what might make her accurate or inaccurate. So first she has to represent the event accurately. So maybe she's thinking of it as a landslide, but it's actually going to be a close election. There are all sorts of errors that can come in here as to how she envisions what the event will be. But let's say that she kind of gets that right. That generates a pre-feeling, yeah, I'll feel really good if my candidate's elected. But now there's other sources of bias. So now she has to correct for unique influences at this time. Maybe she has a cold now, or maybe her car just broke down. Things that are tempering her prediction that aren't going to apply at time 2. She has to correct for the time 2 things, such as the unique influences here. She has to correct for the adaptation that will happen here. And the long and short of it is that all of these are sources of error that can lead to an inaccurate forecast, usually in the direction of overestimating the impact and duration of an emotional event. To give you just one of many illustrations of that, a study we did of a presidential election. This one was the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore, in which we asked people to predict how they would feel. We had both Democrats and Republicans. How will you feel if Gore is elected? How will you feel if Bush is elected? As you know, on election day, no one was elected in this election. So as the intrepid researchers, we got back in touch with them and say, okay, how are you going to feel when the election's actually decided? How will you feel the day after the election's decided? We got back in touch with them the day after the election was decided by the Supreme Court on December 12th, 2000. So on December 13th, we emailed them and said, okay, how happy are you now? And then we got some time passed and asked them to recall how happy they were. Now, the axis here is actually a difference score between how they predicted they would feel minus their baseline level of happiness on a 9-point scale. So what you see, Bush supporters thought, if Bush wins, I will be 3 points happier on a 9-point scale. Gore supporters that if Bush wins, I'll be about 3 points less happy. Pretty massive difference they predicted. That was their prediction in advance about how happy they'd be the day after the election. The day after the election, well, Bush supporters were a little happier. Gore supporters a little less happy. That actually is a pretty big significant difference between the red bars. but you can see not nearly as big a difference as they predicted. And that's a classic case of the impact bias, that people think that these events are going to have a bigger impact than they do. When we asked them several months later to recall how they felt the day after the election, we see our standard kind of memory bias too, where they now are using their theories again about how one probably feels after presidential elections. And they're again overestimating in retrospect as well as in prospect. There's been a lot of debate as to whether these kinds of errors are functional or not. Is it good or bad? Morwedge and Bushell have some recent evidence suggesting there may be a motivational function to the impact bias. We commit the impact bias even more for events we can control, suggesting that maybe it's a way to get us out of bed in the morning to work towards events that we want to happen. But I think it's surely not completely functional. It happens for events people can't control. And we have actually evidence from other studies that sometimes people actually get the valence wrong of a prediction. That in this particular study, they thought revenge would make them feel better when it actually made them feel worse, exerting revenge against someone who had done something bad to them. So again, I think it's a two-edged sword. Maybe a little bit of motivational function, but not completely a good thing. So pretty much the same thing here, no direct access. Affective forecasts are constructions, and accuracy is a two-edged sword. But I want to move on to some kind of bigger picture issues about self-knowledge. And one question that often comes up is, okay, well, how can we achieve it? And if it's true that there is this direct access fallacy, then one answer is that if we want to gain self-knowledge, navel-gazing introspection is not the complete answer. Now again, I don't want to say we should ignore our internal states. Rather, we should use them as data to constructing a good theory about ourselves. And in fact, we have a line of research from several years ago suggesting that too much introspection can actually backfire and confuse us about how we feel. So we do it at our own risk. But the basic message is construct good stories. I'm fond of using stories as a metaphor for self-knowledge, that we construct a narrative as to who we are based on hopefully good data. What are that data? Well, introspection is one source. We should use our internal states as one source of information from which to construct this good story. But we should also use other sources of information. We should observe our behavior and see how we actually respond. We should try to see ourselves through others' eyes. They may actually have a view of us that we should take into account. And to give a shout out to our own field, we should be good consumers of psychological science. Just like we can learn about our bodies from medical science, psychological science can tell us things such as there are implicit biases that might at least lead to the hypothesis that that applies to me as well. But okay, so if self-knowledge is a story, what makes a good story? I would suggest that a good story, first of all, should be believable. It's probably not very adaptable to say that, I'm an alien who arrived yesterday from outer space. It should provide peace of mind. It should be coherent, maybe a little bit flattering, as we'll get to, and maybe somewhat accurate, which I'll return to. But as a slight aside, this metaphor, I think, is useful to know how to help people whose stories aren't working for them very well. There's plenty of cases where people have stories that are leading to maladaptive behaviors or unhappiness. And just to give a shout out to my recent book, there are techniques that have been developed by social psychologists to help people edit their own stories in ways that are beneficial. And this is a really exciting time in social psychology in terms of these interventions. Often they're minimal interventions that are cheap, that can take, in some cases, an hour. And just by framing information to people differently or getting them to write about themselves in various ways can lead to cascading change in their stories with some really good outcome measures. So that's one use of this metaphor. But let's get to this question of accuracy I keep postponing. Should a story be accurate? And by that I simply mean, should it correspond to our actual past, present, and future selves? And there are at least two views on this. One is originally stated by Taylor and Brown, that a little bit of distortion in a positive direction is a good thing, that it helps us get out of bed in the morning, that thinking we can control our futures and that we are better than average is a sign of mental health. But there are those who have challenged that view, some personality psychologists primarily, who say, yeah, but nobody likes a narcissist. That if you go around saying how great you are, you're not going to have many friends eventually. An example of this that I think I'm fond of is if you remember the play Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, Henry Higgins says to his friend Pickering, in reference to his housekeeper, that Mrs. Pierce, that she has the most extraordinary ideas about me. Here I am, a shy, diffident sort of person, and yet she's firmly persuaded that I'm an arbitrary, overbearing, bossy kind of person. I can't account for it. Well, the reason this is so funny is it's obvious that he is an overbearing, arbitrary, bossy kind of person. And so the question is it good for Henry Higgins to have this view or not? I think it's probably pretty good as long as it's not too extreme. Obviously, we don't want huge distortions. There's some recent evidence that self-enhancement is better if we keep it to ourselves than wear it on our sleeves. So if you privately think you're the smartest person in this room, that's probably okay. But if you go around telling everyone you're the smartest person in this room, not so much. And Armour and Taylor had an article in 1998 where they talked about situated optimism, the idea that really what's best is to recognize our flaws when we can do something about it, but there are times when there's not a whole lot we can do, and then maybe it's better to enhance a little bit as a motivator. So I think we should know our flaws well enough to try to improve them, but maybe a little bit of self-enhancement's not so bad. But I want to take a broader look at this. John Lennon famously sang, "Whatever gets you through the night, it's all right, it's all right." And I think I'd like to sort of take this up a level where rather than looking at accuracy in terms of how well I know a particular trait or attitude, I want to talk about some general myths that may be good to have to live our lives by. And I'm going to tell you about 4 such myths that I think are pretty good. Now, I warn you that by telling you about them, I kind of puncture them. So this may not be the most beneficial thing if you agree with me that these myths are important, but here they are. First, I hate to say it, but this is not true. We don't live every day, most of us thinking, yep, today could be the day I die. We kind of live not thinking about that fact, and there may be some benefit to that. Second, this general idea that we're important. And I heard an interesting talk yesterday by Mark Alec where he found that not only do we enhance our positive qualities, people actually also enhance their negative characteristics to some extent, suggesting that we just think we're important people that have this big impact on the world. And I hate to tell you, but we're all kind of grains of sand out there in some sense. Naive realism is the idea that we think we see the world as it is, but in fact we are construing it and interpreting it. And that's a very pervasive bias that maybe has some benefit. And the last one is thinking that the world is more predictable than it is, for which there is considerable evidence, such as the fundamental attribution error, thinking that we can see people as they are and use that to predict their behavior in the future. Now, I'm going to suggest that these myths are good to have to a small degree. So like Goldilocks, I think we have to hold them at just the right level. So it wouldn't be too good for us to go through our days without these myths, thinking, I could die at any moment. I'm really unimportant. Let's face it, 10, 20, 30, surely 100 years from now, no one's going to have any idea who I was or am. Pretty trivial. It's really hard to view the world the way it is. Who knows what's really out there. And I have no idea what's going to happen next. This is not a good way to live our life. Nor, though, is it good to perhaps have the opposite view, that I'm never going to die. I might as well smoke cigarettes and drink as much as I want and drive as fast as I want. That's not so good. Obviously not good to think we're the most important person in the world, that we can view the world completely accurately and predict the world accurately. That leads to gambling problems. So let me just suggest a couple of solutions to this. I think as far as this myth of immortality, perhaps the best approach here is, well, first of all, a good belief system, a good meaning system that allows us to make sense of the world, to think there's a purpose of some sort. Obviously, religion can play this role to allow us to feel that, yes, we are not immortal, but there's a larger purpose to the world, and come up with a good purpose. So you've probably noticed if you read New Yorker cartoons and others that there's a whole series of cartoons of people climbing the mountain and finding the guru to discover what the meaning of life is. And in this one, this guy climbs the mountain and he finds out that the meaning of life is a bitch and then you die. That's not a good belief system. Yeah, we got to have something that keeps us going. And that could be many things. So here's a guy who climbs the mountaintop and he finds out the meaning of life is cats. Well, if that works for you, then why not? Or if, like from the movie Bull Durham, you like the woman who says, I believe in the Church of Baseball. It doesn't really matter what your belief is as long as it gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. But there's also something I think helps with this myth that is underappreciated, and that is just a good sense of humor. That looking at life with a smile, this is something that I learned from my dear friend Dan Wagner, who every day, I think, lived with humor, even when he passed away a couple of years ago. There are many cartoons with this source of this idea as well. So here's death visiting us. It happened. They came for me. So let's all laugh. That's the principle there. Well, what about self-importance? I mean, obviously, we shouldn't think we're totally unimportant people, but you have to have some dose of humility. I like this T-shirt that says, I'm kind of a big deal on a fairly irrelevant social media site that falsely inflates my ego. That's probably pretty healthy. Naive realism, well, I do think it's probably good for us most of the time to think that we're seeing the world the way it is, but to realize that, there are certainly times when it's important for us to know that it really is an interpretation and to be able to realize that. As far as predictability goes, having some idea of thinking we have some idea of what will happen next is a good thing as well. So to wrap up, I would say that when it comes to looking at our past selves, looking at our current self, or looking at our future self, just keep in mind that it's all about the story that we construct, and we should do so with care. And I'll leave you with some lyrics from a singer, Courtney Barnett, who is a wonderful independent singer with a new album out. And she has these lines: we either think that we're invincible or that we're invisible. Realistically, we're somewhere in between. Thank you very much. I guess there's or not. My mic is off. Okay, yeah, we have time for a question or two. Yeah.
I wonder how you reconcile your view that we see the self as consistent and stable with research suggesting that people think they change more and will change more in the future than other people will.
Well, I'd have to look at that research because we have some research showing this end of history illusion that people, regardless of what age you ask them, they think they're pretty much done changing, is what we found in our research. Yeah.
Introspection is not like sense perception. You don't have a little organ to look in. It's a conceptual achievement. It requires focus, thought, integration, And it seems to me that one of the reasons people are so bad at knowing themselves is that they never learn how to do it. And don't bother to do it, and psychologists often disallow the concept to even be used.
Well, I'm open to the possibility, and certainly some forms of meditation claim that training improves introspection. So I'm open to that possibility. I do think there are still limits that training is not going to get us totally there.
Not taught.
Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time, so I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Thank you.